But
Yeah.
or your God. Now the question is, there still must be some it that remains the same, while the attributes of the thing are changing, or it'll be very difficult for us to talk about it. So the question that Aristotle asks here is, what are the more continuous, more existing things on which we can anchor our discourse about change, things which themselves exist, while possible?
Welcome back.
I'm trying to say, you keep repeating the same thing over.
It's really hard Aristotle.
Yes, I get the point.
I mean,
It's not happy, but
that's
it
how
is
people
happy,
are.
but
They
it is happy.
repeat. They tell you what they're going to tell you. They just keep going.
Remember how old this stuff is.
Oh yeah.
No, true.
That's what I
You
was
know,
saying.
I mean, you know,
when I
it
emailed you.
reminds me of a joke about a couple of friends, and the one friend says, "I've got tickets to a Shakespeare play. Do you want to go?" And I've never been to a Shakespeare play. Well, let's go. So they go to the Shakespeare play, and after the play is over, they're walking away, and he said, "So, what did you think?" He said, "Well, it was really interesting and everything, but it was full of so many cliches." That's the joke. It was so right.
That's where it started.
Right. You know, well, that's where the cliches started, right? You know, so in a way, you know, when we're looking at Aristotle, this is where a lot of these ideas originated, and they're so commonsensical now, and so many, you know, so many of them, that you think, gosh, you know, he's had that much impact on us for over 2,000 years.
I mean, we're still talking about it, so obviously it's important.
Oh,
so.
yeah. Well, I suppose there's a couple things that are really significant, and the question of what is the soul? Well, on one hand, okay, if I ask that, a lot of us, I remember one of you responded by looking up a dictionary response to that, like, oh, well, the dictionary, you know, what's the question? What is the soul? Well, let's go to the dictionary. The dictionary has the answer. Remember, the dictionary is just making things up, right?
Is that what they do, really?
Yeah, they did. In fact, you know, you have to be an old guy wearing a tie with a sweater, and you go around door to door and you say, "What do you mean by soul?" You know, and then you write it down. You know, and you collect this all together, and you keep adding to it until eventually you have the OED, you know, which is the Oxford English Dictionary, which is so big that you need a magnifying glass in order to. It comes with its own magnifying glass in the box, right, so that you can read it. Because they just keep adding to it. You know, eventually they might, you know, delete some things, but for the most part, they just keep adding to it. So what does it do? It reflects common usage by literally asking people what they mean by a word, and they tell you, right? But so when you go to the dictionary and you think, aha, this is what the soul is. Well, the trouble we have really with something like that is we've got lots of different people over the history of thought trying to explain something that's so important to us. It's me. What is my soul? Well, they're asking, what's me, right? And you know, so we end up, well, as a kid, I was raised Roman Catholic. I was told by the nuns in grammar school that inside of me there was a milk bottle. Just like I would have, you know, bought milk in, you know, a little same glass shaped, you know, bottle that you would get delivered at your door, you know. We didn't have horse and buggy milkmen then. They actually had a truck. It looks like our mail trucks, you know, drove up. You know, you could hear them in the morning clinking with the glass, you know, dropping the bottles off, you know, and you know, we even had like a little ice box thing, you know, where you would put it in and stuff, right? And when I would go to school at recess, I would get to have either white milk or chocolate milk, right? And I liked the chocolate milk, right? So, but I had to have my quarter, otherwise I couldn't get it. Or dime or whatever it was, right? So you had to have the money for it. And the nun would just take those of us down for milk that had paid. You know, the rest of us that hadn't paid, well, they stayed in the classroom while the others went down and basically drank the milk, you know, in the little doorway. We didn't even have seats or anything. We just stood there. You know. But so inside of me, there's this milk bottle. And if I keep it pure, it stays white, right? If I sin, venial sins, I end up with these little splotches all over it, right? And that's bad, right? But if I commit a mortal sin, like I murder someone, right? Remember, I'm in grammar school, right? Yeah. Although I saw on the internet today, I don't know if it's believable or not, but they said that ISIS just executed, no, it was Egypt, executed a 4-year-old because he murdered someone. 4-year-old? Did you see that? Is that true? What the heck? But in any case, so here I am, a little kid, and they say, I've got this glass bottle in me, and if I commit a mortal sin, it's just black, the whole thing. I was, number one, trying to make sure I didn't do any sinning whatsoever, right? But the other thing was, I'm really anxious about having this glass bottle inside of me somewhere.
What if it breaks?
Yeah, what if I fall down and it breaks? That's, you know, they didn't even explain that, you know, so.
God will take care of
He
it.
was sentenced to life in prison.
Sentenced to life in prison. How does a 4-year-old murder someone, though? I don't want to find out.
I do.
I do. Yeah.
You can fill the rest of it.
Yeah, I'll let you know on the break.
That's your assignment for the evening.
Sorry about that. But I mean, that was very impressive as a kid. You know, so I, from very young, was convinced that the most important part of me was some abstract part of me that was different than my body. And absolutely, it continued on after the death of the body. So that was something that was brought home to me very soon too, that the main thing I had to worry about was eternal life after the death of the body. And that was because my soul was going to be there, you know, for all eternity. And I basically had my choice. Did I want to go to heaven, or did I want to go to purgatory for a while and then heaven, or did I want to go to hell, which would be just absolutely, you know, suffering, sitting there with the lawyers, you know. That's almost a joke, right?
When did,
All the jokes about that.
this is a little bit more modern question, but when did the idea of purgatory come about? Because that's unique just to Catholic, isn't it?
Well, I mean, the most famous discussion or art about it is, of course, Dante's
Inferno.
Well, the Inferno is hell. Purgatorio is purgatory, and Cielo is heaven. So he goes through these 3 stages, and it's all political, because he basically takes his political enemies and he puts them in the various stages where he thinks they will go. And it's pretty clear who he's talking about, etc. But so purgatory is there. It's pretty clear that they had to invent it, right? That's pretty obvious, you know, that people invented these various punishments. You know, Socrates, of course, when he's in the Phaedo talking about death, he's basically saying, well, there's a 50-50 chance that I can either, you know, have a life after death, or, you know, that the end of the body will be the end of everything, right? You know, so there's a 50-50 chance. You know, who knows? No one's ever come back. We still say that. We don't know if there's a life after death. I mean, we get some, of course, interesting stories. People on the operating table, people that literally have died, you know, been frozen in a pond for what, almost a whole day, and yet they revive them, and in a way they talk about the bright light and all this stuff, right? It sounds, you know, how do we explain all that? But you get the basic idea that we can't really say what is going to happen after life, right? Don't know. But Socrates thinks there's a good chance that he's going to end up having a discussion. It's going to be like one symposium after the other with all these wonderful people that he'd love to meet. You know, so that question you see that goes around, if you had the chance to sit on this bench with one person from all of history, who would it be? You know, it's just interesting, you know, how we do that. So he was kind of hypothesizing that too. Remember too that Plato gives us the idea that this is the right way to think about it, that the soul is the real part of us that's significant, and the body is just this mortal coil that you kind of shirk off at the end of the body's life, and so on, right? The prison house of the soul, right? But when we get to Aristotle, that's where we get an interesting difference, of course, because now, for Aristotle, substance is a requirement for anything to be. And what he means by substance is something very, very concrete. You know, it's got to be real stuff. And you know, I don't know that he really gets into problems with subatomic. You know, there's no interest in subatomic particles. He does talk about the earth, air, fire, water as what makes up everything. But at the same time, as far as he's concerned, he's just talking about solid stuff, right? They don't have microscopes. They don't know how small things get, right? They don't have telescopes, so they don't know how big the universe gets, right? None of that. So it's just kind of like the common sense, rudimentary sense that, you know, everything that exists has to have substance, and then it has to have a shape. You can't have a substance without a shape.
So what was his explanation for air that he couldn't see, but he could feel?
You know, what's interesting is they knew that there was air, they could feel it. And the definition of air from several generations back was that air was a physical substance, and yet at the same time had no shape. So that's an interesting question. How does he handle that? Fire is the same problem too, because fire was something you could see, but what is the shape of it? So basically, it takes the shape of whatever it's in. Same thing with water. Water so if I pour water into a cup and then pour it into a bowl, it changes shape depending on the container. So I'm hypothesizing that what he was thinking that gave the substance its shape was the container. And air, essentially, would be around the Earth. I don't think they had any sense of how far up the atmosphere went at all. No clue about any of that. They really didn't have a sense of how far things were. I mean, there were some arguments over calculations to how far the stars would have to be. And basically their argument was, no, if that calculation is right, it's unimaginably far. And even so, their calculations were pretty low. But nonetheless, their idea was, well, if it's going to be that far, it's just totally unworkable. There's no way that the cosmos could be that big. So they're just basically refusing to deal with that kind of thing. But Aristotle has to explain the soul at the same time as he says that everything is made out of substance. And so his explanation is the soul is the activity of the body. Now, that's something that you could see, you know, and it's obviously different depending on the type of body. So a plant has a soul. What is the soul of the plant? The plant is to be, right? But to some extent, it's certainly animate, right? Because if the sun, you know, is moving across, I think it's pretty obvious that the flower kind of rotates a bit to follow the sun, right? You watch the leaves on the trees when it's getting ready to rain, and they flip over or whatever they do, depending on the tree, right? So in a sense, there's movement there. It's very, very slow, though. It's not you know, we don't expect the tree to get up and walk about, stuff like that. But nonetheless, there is animation. It's grows, right? And so rocks do not grow, so a rock doesn't have a soul. If you saw the picture in the text of the bronze horse with the young boy sitting on it, right? The argument is that the horse has a soul, the rider has a soul, but the bronze statue of the boy riding the horse does not have a soul, right? So soul has to be associated with the actual animation of whatever animal it is, right? And so the animation stops when the body dies. So with Plato, the soul is released. Now, where does it go? Good question, right? For some, clearly, it's going to re-enter the meat of another body, a reincarnation back to the meat, right, of some other body. And that's a motif that we see in India and Persia, I think. That's actually kind of interesting, though, because Alexander the Great, who was a student of Aristotle, engages different wise men in discussions about the things that he had studied with Aristotle while he's in India, and it's about that time that the Buddha arrives. So there's an interesting problem there. Does the Buddha come first, or is the Buddha a part of kind of the reaction to the Greek influence in India? Won't be able to answer that, right? But it's an interesting hypothesis that there could have been the influence that Alexander spreading Socrates' ideas, Aristotle's ideas, Plato's ideas, getting people to wonder. The Jainists, I think, if you're familiar with the discussion he has with them. And it's interesting, too, because it's very similar to the discussion he has famously with Diogenes, right? The cynic. With Diogenes, Diogenes is just lying there famously in the sun, getting a tan or whatever he was doing, relaxing. And Alexander had heard that Diogenes was there, so Alexander goes over to Diogenes and says, "I'm Alexander, is there anything I can do for you?" And Diogenes looks up at him and squints and says, "You can step out of my sun." And Ptolemy, the general that was with him, oh, this is going to be bad for Diogenes. But instead of being angry at Diogenes for saying that, he turned to Ptolemy and said, "You know, if I wasn't Alexander, I would want to be Diogenes." And walked on. And in the discussion he has with the Jains, right? The Jains are the ones that don't want to harm anything, right? And they were furious with Alexander because his whole point of life seemed to be to go everywhere he could and harm everything he could, right? They're just the opposite of their beliefs, right? So they had arguments with him, and apparently Alexander, in talking with him, was convinced that they were right, that the best thing would be to harm no one, and so on. And that basically the amount of space you take up is the space you're standing in. And when you die, the space you'll take up will be the amount of space that it takes to bury you. That's, so we're all equal, the same. They don't take up any more space or whatever. And Alexander apparently thought their argument was a good one. Didn't get mad at them or anything, but then went off and did everything the opposite. Continued to kill and maim and destroy and take as much as he could. Alexander, right? But so there's an interesting impact that he had on other cultures, and that's it's apparently still there today. If you ever saw, it's kind of silly, but if you ever saw the movie The Man Who Would Be King with Sean Connery and I forget who the other main actor was, at one point they're captured in Afghanistan and they're going to kill them because they're acting like they were gods or something. And right as the one chief monk is about ready to stab him, he sees that he has the Masonic pin on his neck. And he stops because that's a sacred symbol. And he realizes he must be God. And where does it come from? Alexander. Alexander was a Mason. Oh no. Silly plot. I don't know. This is just one of those things. But so Alexander has all this influence, even in Afghanistan, according to the movie The Man Who Would Be King, at least. So who knows? But with the soul, the problem is that for Aristotle, at the death of the body, the movement stops. And if the soul is the movement, then there is no afterlife. You're done with the end of the movement of the body. Now, think about how the significance of this difference plays out. After Aristotle teaches Alexander, he's going to have time to have his own school in Athens, and it's going to be called the Lyceum. It's going to be basically down the way from the Academy, which is the school that Plato taught at, and his followers taught at. And that was on a park that was basically donated to them, to the city, by a man named Academus, which is where it got its name, right? But so the one school teaches Plato, Plato's philosophy, and eventually became a school of skepticism. So by the time we see Hypatia teaching at the Academy's offshoot down in Alexandria, Egypt, around 350, I guess, AD, by then the Academy is skeptic. Its philosophy has become skepticism, right? But Aristotle's philosophy, which seems so clearly superior to Plato's, is eclipsed because Alexander dies. Alexander's a Macedonian, not a Greek. So the Athenians hated being dominated by these Macedonians. And Aristotle is in league with him. So Aristotle has to flee from Athens, lest Athens sin twice against philosophy and kill him, right?
Where exactly is Macedonian, like today?
Oh,
I've heard that term.
It's just above.
Turkey.
No, it's on the Greek peninsula. I don't know if the area of it is the same now exactly as it was, but do you see that green spot there?
Yeah.
So here's Greece. Right? See that pretty clearly? So here's Greece. Here's Macedonia.
That'd be like between modern Greece and.
They don't even speak Greek, as far as I know. I believe they speak a language called Macedonian. So I imagine it's similar in some ways, but.
Did it get all mixed up?
Oh yeah, this is a current map. So what were the actual limits before, over time? Darn good question. Aristotle himself was called a Stagirite. He was from Stagira, which is in Greece, just over the border with Macedonia. So his father and his mother were both physicians, medical physicians, and in fact his father was the court physician to Philip, who was the king of Macedonia.
He was the Greek king, and his mother was Macedonian.
Well, I'm pretty sure Philip was a Macedonian himself,
He was.
and was basically on the verge of leading an army against. Now, so the thing is, they can have kind of like a federation of forces, as they did when they fought against Persia. A lot of the city-states all came together to fight. Not all of them wholeheartedly. I mean, some of the like the plot of the 300, if you saw that movie, I think that's pretty close to history in a lot of ways. Unlike the movie Troy, which was horrible. But if you follow the political things there, the Spartans want to fight, but some even of Spartans were actually in league with the Persians, thinking it would be a good thing to become part of Persia, right? So there was infighting among the various city-states whether or not they wanted to go to war against this tremendous empire, or literally just become part of the empire.
Like, for today's minds, Sparta and Greek are one and the same. All the
Well, Sparta is not Macedonia. Sparta was part of Greece.
So they consider themselves Greeks or Spartans?
Spartans thought of themselves as Greeks, but Macedonians
Thought of themselves as
were
Macedonians.
separate people.
I thought
And
they wanted to be included in Greece, Macedonians.
they conquered Greece. Alexander took Greece.
Yeah.
That was part of the, and they do refer to his empire as Hellenic or Greek. So that's actually an odd thing. Wait a minute, but he wasn't Greek. He was Macedonian. What's the deal, right? But even today, I believe Macedonians hate being confused with the Greeks. They like their independence and separate. Because this is still.
So Alexander, he conquered the Greek, and then when he died, then
Yeah,
Greece.
so he dies at an early age, 33, after, if you ever get to follow,
Conquering the world.
the BBC did a terrific program in the footsteps of Alexander, where they literally have this guy with a British accent, of course, following in the footsteps of Alexander, literally traveling through the whole area and talking about the different battles he had and how he jumped over the wall and got wounded and all this other stuff, right? So really, really great, because he ended up coming back up through the desert, lost a lot of men. He himself ended up being ill and not really recovering, and then dying. And there's, of course, all sorts of problems. That's just like Scalia, right? No one really knows what happened, and they didn't do an autopsy. Well, they didn't have the same kind of autopsy. Justice Scalia, everybody's arguing over, what happened to Scalia. No one wants to know.
He was hunting in Texas. He got shot by Cheney.
But they kind of fuel the fire of conspiracy sometimes, how they handle these things.
What I heard was he was shooting at some birds, and he pulled sharply to the left, and his body was so shocked by that motion after a lifetime of pulling to the right. Killed.
Couldn't take the stress.
Shocked his body.
He ended up having a heart attack
I
that
can
night.
imagine they don't want that to come out.
Sorry. But the thing is, they fought over what killed Alexander. Plus because it could have been poison, it could have been someone killed him, could have been that he died of his injuries. That's
He had gout.
and plus, where did the body end up? They're still looking for it, by the way. They're digging another tell in Greece right now. It is in Macedonia that they're trying to dig up, thinking it. This is obviously some great hero. I haven't heard yet what they've discovered. But what were you saying, Tom?
Well, if they didn't preserve it properly, it just went back to the earth. It just turned back into a bunch of chemicals and
But
it's
chances are
basically
they-
fertilizer.
a leader like that, they're gonna have some kind of tomb for him.
That's what everyone thinks. There was some sort of special tomb, and it was hidden.
Things.
But where? Because the generals literally fought over the body, right? Who gets it? Where does it go? Some people wanted to take it back to Macedonia, to,
Yeah, exactly.
back home.
Underwater.
Others wanted to bury it right there and so on. And even the empire itself was split 3 ways. So Ptolemy got Egypt and below, and Antiochus got Greece and the north, and Seleucid got everything else. So the 3 different, and those become empires. So Antioch becomes the capital for Antiochus, and Ptolemy becomes the ancestor of the pharaohs that included Ptolemy, the other Ptolemies, including Cleopatra of Julius Caesar and Mark Antony fame, right? Those were actually Greeks, right? They were Greek pharaohs. So Aristotle fled Athens, and his school basically disappears as a result of that. And Plato's school then becomes the dominant one throughout much of history following that. There are some other influential schools. We'll see the Epicureans, which are also located in Athens. Epicurus is another Greek contemporary philosopher that has his own school, clearly has Aristotelian and Socratic elements in his philosophy. Epictetus will be one that we'll also look at, who was Greek but a Roman slave, and so he ends up being a counselor on Nero's court, even though he's a slave, until the end of his life, when he is freed and ends up doing his own school as well. So the interesting thing is, when Christianity arises, Plato's philosophy is the philosophy that's like the common sense science of the day. And so, among all the infighting of the early church fathers, whether or not they should incorporate philosophy or not, the end result is yes, we should merge. So the whole conflict, what is there between Jerusalem and Athens? What's the connection? Should there be a connection? Well, the answer is that Christianity becomes a blend of the Hebrew scriptural elements, Jesus, and Greek philosophy. And the Greek philosophy it becomes a blend with is Plato's philosophy. And so the conception of the soul is this indivisible spiritual element that's connected to our body but isn't our body. And that's the real self, right? That's really me. That's Plato's thinking, right?
And how did it get blended? Like how it just all of a sudden just Plato just kept talking about it, and when Christianity came along, it just kind of made sense. It just molded automatically.
Well, no, it's a very incremental, bit by bit evolution. But the main theologian, philosopher that we'll use as our explanation for this will be Augustine, St. Augustine.
And he was around after the death of Plato.
Oh, Augustine is in the 5th century, so he's 440 AD.
Okay, so it's quite a while after.
Oh yes,
Plato
oh yes.
passes away. It's actually quite a while after Christ's life passes away.
That's weird. No one knows how he looks. So born 354, dies 430 AD. That's AD, right? So, oh yeah, we're looking at what? Socrates dies in 399. Plato dies in what, 3 no, I'm going backwards, 4 something. Remember, wait, no, it's good. It goes the other way. We're in BC, you're born,
Higher the number, the farther.
and the number gets smaller.
Right.
You know, yes, you gotta go this way, right? So Socrates dies 399, so that's at least 20 years or so after that we see Plato die, and there's a 20-year overlap between him and Aristotle, and then so we're getting closer and closer to, but nowhere really near AD, right? And someone argued, well, they didn't even have the year 0 yet, so that's why the puzzlement went from 1 BC to 1 AD. But the thing is, it wasn't that's not how they were counting at that time. That was a system imposed retrospectively by the church much later after that, when they had a 0. So they just miscalculated, I think, because you needed a year 0 for the overlap, and they forgot about it. So that's pretty weird. But you get the idea. That's hundreds of years later, at least 800 years later. So that's quite a lot. But what we're going to see is a quite involved evolution of thought about what Jesus meant, how we interpreted the scriptures that we have from the evangelists and the apostles, right? And so what do you interpret? Who Jesus was, etc. And since the common sense science of the day was Plato, and the soul was this invisible spiritual attachment to the body, that's what they commonly figured that's what was important to us. That's what Jesus saved. Jesus was saving your soul, not your body. So it becomes a very aesthetic, Platonic set of beliefs in the beginning of the church. And the soul is the most important thing. And the dogma of the church is all concerned with making sure your soul is protected. And that kept up when, if you ever toured California, this is in California. This is Father Sierra's cell, his room, right? Which, by the way, that it's kind of interesting when Leeuwenhoek invented the first microscope and looked at cork slices and saw all these little shapes in it. It reminded him of the way a monastery is arranged with all the little cells for the monks. And so that's why those little shapes were called cells, and that's why we still think of our cells, because of that interesting connection. But this is his room, and on the wall was his whip. I don't see it in the picture, but I remember when I was there, I saw the shelf with his whip on it. And I thought, whoa, so you get the image of the monk whipping himself, before going to bed, to remind the body that the soul is dominant over the body. The body is sinful, corrupt. What's important is the milk bottle soul, right? Don't yield to temptation, right? To protect your soul.
After knowing that you have this milk bottle filled with white fluid, why did you ever drink chocolate milk? Yeah. Doesn't that make sense?
Didn't put the two of them together. Did not put the two of them together. Now, the way that the soul gets corrupted is by sins. And the kinds of sins I learned as a kid not to do were lying to your mother, lying to your mother, lying to your mother, lying to your mother. And when I got older, masturbating was, never do that,
And reading Freud.
Oh, that was handed to me by a priest. That was a requirement to read for.
Wasn't
So
that
I
more like a comic book?
Your mom found the book.
Yeah.
Yeah, oh yeah, I'll never forget it, you know.
I think I think the Opus Dei still practice self-flagellation, don't they?
Opus Dei,
Opus
yeah,
Dei,
yeah.
yeah.
They still practice that in the Philippines.
Well, they do.
I'm
yeah.
sure.
One day a
Crucified
year
themselves
where
or
they
still-
do
It's not just Christian. I've seen other cultural groups where people walk through the streets whipping themselves, bleeding, just
Bleeding.
you know, beating themselves up. Muslims do this too. It seems like almost every culture. I'm not sure, but you know, every culture seems to have some kind of intellectual hierarchy that thinks that the soul is separate from the body and that the body's temptations are evil for the soul. So you have to somehow control the body so that the soul is protected from the earthiness of the body. The earth attracts the body because the body is earth, right? So the body wants the things of the earth, but the soul is somehow separate from all of that, and we're trying to protect our soul from contamination.
Isn't it kind of weird that if they're viewed as separate, then somehow still acts on the body can corrupt the soul?
Yeah. Oh, well, today I think we would basically say it's all nonsense. But how do we handle it? Because, you know, so when I ask the question, what is your soul? That's still what we think of as us. But what is it? What is it now?
Oh, isn't that backwards though? We don't have souls. We are a soul that just happens to have a body.
That's C.S. Lewis that says that, right?
So we're not a bunch of beings walking around. We're a soul that has a vessel which happens to
No,
be
I'm
on
only speaking about how they were looking at it.
And
How they're
yeah, and how they were connected.
like if they're separate, how can an act of the body influence the soul?
Yeah, I get it.
Yeah. Well, for Aristotle, ethica means character. So when we talk about ethics, we're talking about your character. You know, are you an ethical person? Do you have a good character, right?
moral virtues.
Right. And it seems to me in our society that we think of certain kinds of people as having a certain moral character, being good people. And it has to do with how they behave, obviously, right? And so if you steal from other people, that's bad character. If you give of your largesse, your extra, to other people, that's good character. I was mentioning Amartya Sen earlier. See, if I was buying something, I would of course click yes.
But
Because I want to have good character, right? You know, but so, remember, he's very, very liberal, Harvard political professor, kind of took over for John Rawls when John Rawls died quite a few years ago, but also associated with Martha Nussbaum. So you know, he's into Aristotle, and what he mostly argues today with regard to the disparity of wealth, well, some people, you know, the 1% have all this wealth, and everyone else is basically doing without, especially the lowest class have the least, right? That's unfair. So what he's trying to do is persuade the wealthy to give their much of their wealth to distribute, you know, to others, right? And so he argues that your character basically will be happiest not because of the wealth you have, but because of the wonderful things you do. wonderful things you do is what will make you happy. There are some wealthy people like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett and others that are on this. I mean, granted, I don't think what they're giving up is anywhere near going to bankrupt them. I'm sure that they can continue to live incredibly wealthy lives with.
That's been common for a while though. Like even the robber barons, like on their, like close to their deathbeds, like they became the biggest philanthropists that the world has ever known.
The Carnegies and
and they were, the biggest a-holes throughout their whole life.
If you die wealthy, he didn't call it a sin, but he referred to it as something that's not so good.
Yeah, it's like a waste or something.
Who was that?
Right.
Yeah.
I don't remember if it was
Dale
Carnegie.
Carnegie.
It's one of those.
Steve,
I know
you know,
it was
turn of the
Carnegie, and then
century.
who was the other one? Carnegie was steel, right? And then
Yeah.
what was the railroad?
Then with the,
And
Yeah,
not
that
the
was-
Rockefellers. It was
Rockefellers were bankers, I think,
Yeah.
primarily.
were they?
was it? Okay, maybe it was like they got in like a competition, like they had competed.
Vanderbilts?
Might have been. It was one of the robber barons, but like and the Carnegies, they like at the end of their life, like they had competed to see who could amass the most wealth their whole life, and at the end they were like competing to see who could outgive the other person. So,
Yeah, well, they
philosophy
today we hear them talk about old money, the old culture. They felt the obligation to distribute at least some of their wealth with, the libraries. I think it was Dale Carnegie built all the libraries in New York, and the museums and the opera houses and all the cultural things really came from that.
yeah.
And what happens, of course, then as we get to a new period of wealth where the entrepreneurs that become really, really wealthy, like Bill Gates, and so computer geeks, become super wealthy very quickly. They did not grow up wealthy. They became super wealthy, and so they didn't have the culture that said your ethic, your character depended not so much on how much money you had and stuff you had as what you did with it, right? So there was a sudden shift as they started getting older, and Bill Gates was the first one I especially remember doing that, and realizing they did have to give back. And so, of course, Bill Gates is giving lots of money to prevent malaria, just buying the mosquito nets and education, free laptops with Microsoft on it for every kid in Africa,
Well, they're doing
lined
a
up
lot.
ones.
Isn't it Zuckerberg and Gates that are doing the STEM classrooms in the U.S.?
They are, I think.
But they're having a
I
lot to do
have
with
no
it.
clue how many things they're doing.
Yeah, like they're working together because they were with the big push for Common Core,
Yeah.
and then so they were.
And they changed their mind too once they realized, hey, this isn't working. Then
Well,
they-
it sounds like the idealistic Common Core is still right, but how the law ended up coming out, because even the people who ended up making the tests or whatever for it said that they were completely on board with Common Core the whole time, but then by the time, the government got done fighting over compromises about what the law would actually read, like it was garbage. It was never going to work.
Is it still in play? Common Core? I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
still.
In all the schools or just
Not
some?
all of
They-
them.
It's
yeah.
it's if you want a certain amount of like federal matching or something.
Yeah. Does that apply only to math, or is that like other subjects?
I think it's
math.
Just
I'm
math?
pretty sure it's math.
That's all
Well,
I've
it
ever
might
heard
be.
was math. I'm sure that is.
yeah,
other
it's more than
things,
that.
math.
The idea is
So there's a video of a woman trying to solve a problem. Did you see that?
with the
Ridiculous.
yeah.
you should okay because
You can actually figure it out. They are actually. They are-
if
Well,
you
why would you do that?
if you look at because my Facebook was blowing up about it one day, so I'm like I'm just gonna try to learn this. If you actually look at like go to like some YouTube videos about like teach me Common Core math, it makes sense once you get through it. It takes longer to get to 1 + 1 = 2, but by the time you get there, it's like learning the philosophy behind why 1 + 1 = 2, rather than just
Well,
memorization.
that comes with time, like, and why wouldn't you just do, what's wrong with the old way? I mean,
But there's so many old ways.
The idea, I think, was actually to try to get us closer towards. There's something to do with Common Core, and learning it in that way would get you closer to like how we need to use that, like for computer programming and stuff, like the methodology behind it and the way you get to the answer is supposed to make more sense
So
once
it's
you
more
get to.
But the issue,
Yeah.
of course, is how do the wealthy use their wealth?
Yeah.
Are they using it in a way that's good for others? What Martha Nussbaum and Amartya Sen say about Aristotle is that, well, Aristotle is not even aware yet of the sense of the individual that we think of. The concept of individual with individual rights and property literally ends up developing in the modern period after Descartes with contemporaries of Descartes and Thomas Hobbes, John Locke.
Wasn't he more
Rousseau.
individualistic than Plato, though?
Oh,
Because Plato based things, well, Plato, Socrates.
You mean
slash
Hobbes?
Socrates. No,
Aristotle.
Plato versus Aristotle were more society-based or community-based. The good of the community
Well,
was
what
one of the higher.
these say is that Aristotle is much more, man is a political animal, the zoon politikon, we're social beings. We become more individualistic in the modern period. And part of that is because of a reaction to Aristotle. Because if you think, well, the church is predominantly Platonic in the dogma and its understanding of our relationships to the world. So even arrows travel where they want to travel because God wills them to hit the target. So there's no Sir Isaac Newton or Galileo, motion laws that dictate how things happen. God is constantly making things happen. But when the Crusades, by the Third Crusade with King Richard the Lionheart, his men beat Saladin's army in at least a couple specific battles, the Battle of Arsuf being probably the biggest one. And as a result, they make it to Jerusalem, and they end up basically forming a peace treaty with Saladin, so that Christians and others get visitation rights to the Holy City, right, and other cities along the route, right? So Christians can visit the Holy Land again, right? The contracts, the deal was made by monks, his monks, the literate monks that he had with him, and Moses ben Maimon, Moses Maimonides, ben Maimon, there's multiple ways of saying it. So he was Saladin's advisor, and he was a Aristotelian. He had studied Aristotle, had in fact written, because he was also a rabbi, Jewish rabbi, so he was also trying to figure out ways of explaining the Jewish religion in terms of Aristotle's philosophy, because Aristotle was so clearly dominant over Plato. And he hands these books to the monks who take them back to Europe. And when I think about that, if you ever saw the movie Independence Day, where the two Americans fly up in the stolen spaceship and plug into the alien mothership and upload with a Mac, You know, an Apple computer, right? You know, I've never seen an Apple computer actually connect to another system successfully, except for that one occasion. And when they did, they blew up the other ship. So clearly, it's not good for you to plug in an Apple.
No, they had to use a nuke to blow it up. Shit.
The virus.
Oh, the virus.
The
The
virus
virus.
just
Brought the
travels
ships
down.
down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They actually used a nuke. to
Oh,
blow the
you
ship.
know, I totally missed that. I just remember the,
It still crashes.
You should get caught up so the second one's coming
Yeah,
out later
see,
this
yeah.
year.
I just remember the alien space going
Gonna
down.
be in it?
No, he's not in it.
No,
Who, Will Smith?
Boom.
Yeah, he's not in it.
Damn it.
Matt Damon wasn't rescued in that one.
No.
No, he was rescued in
Hey, he's coming
Saving
out
Private
with
Ryan,
The
Martian, and Interstellar, right?
No, he was murdered.
He wasn't in
He-
Interstellar.
He,
He was in
he was the
Interstellar.
opposite of saving in Interstellar. Yeah, he
No,
was.
and The Martian he was saved.
Matt Damon?
Yeah, he was the guy on that big ice rock planet that was trying
Oh,
to kill
yeah,
everyone.
yeah.
Oh,
He's
yeah.
right.
Yeah,
was out there
yeah,
with
but they
Woody.
were trying to save him. He did
Yeah.
spend a lot of
Yeah.
federal
actually,
dollars.
right, yeah.
That's true.
They tried to save him and he tried to murder him before doing it.
I'm not gonna see The Martian. I don't wanna see another, you know.
Matt Damon getting saved, really?
Oh, but it's
No.
incredible at growing tomato,
Potatoes.
Potatoes out of poos.
It was awesome.
One of the first men to do anything on Mars.
Loved it.
But that's the pirate definition?
Yeah, that was sweet. I
Other
love
than the
that.
Yeah.
windstorm.
I was
Well,
watching there.
so the
Yeah.
monks
So
come
you
back
know,
to Western Europe with Aristotle and the dogma of the church. You have to believe the dogma of the church or you'll be burned at the stake. I mean, this is heresy, right? You know, so you have to believe what the church teaches, even about with regard to the earth being the center of the cosmos, right? Right? But along comes Aristotle, you know, and monks are excited because this is good stuff. Within a relatively, like, 100 years, you end up with everyone referring to Aristotle as the philosopher. And so it's not like there's any even other philosophers as far as they're concerned. There's the philosopher, Aristotle. But the problem, of course, is, well, just think about this one characteristic. For Aristotle, the soul dies with the body. There's no afterlife. So the whole point of life, of getting your soul to heaven, is gone. So, of course, that's an incredible problem for the church. How are they going to deal with that? You know, Aquinas is essentially the one that's tagged to solve this problem, and he's an Aristotelian, and we end up, you know, with the interesting dilemmas now of the body coming back. You know, so when your body dies, your soul doesn't go anyplace. It has to wait, because the soul is the activity of the body. So while you're in the grave, the soul is just waiting there, not doing anything, until the body itself is resurrected, and then you're back, right? So that's the new dogma, right? That's Aquinas. Wow. So, and
I didn't realize that was
Yeah.
a new dogma. That's
well,
If
I
you
mean,
think
that's
about it that
Aquinas, right? So, and by the way, a lot of Christians did not like that, and that's one of the things I think that precipitates the Protestant Reformation, is they're rebelling against this. They remain Augustinian. So the end result of all of this is we look at our culture right now, and I ask you guys, wow, what is your soul? You're mostly giving me back a Platonic, Augustinian response to this, because the United States is primarily a Protestant country.
Well, isn't that pretty much how each of them, Methodist, Protestant, Baptist, there was some kind of a change going on within the church, and each one of them said, no, we don't believe in that, we're an offshoot, we're sticking with this, being their own little secular conservative group.
Exactly.
Just
Yeah.
step.
In fact, with the freedom of religion idea in the United States, you end up with individuals. I remember one day in the spine, walking through the UAA near the student union area, seeing a group of kids lounging around, and said hello, etc. Are you students? No, we're just passing through. Okay, so where are you heading? Oh, we're going to found our own church. They said they're going to start their own church. Oh, which seminary did you just come from? Nope, never been to a seminary. We just read the Bible. We're all set. They're going to start their own church basically based on the Bible, their own interpretation of the Bible.
Which one?
It is a thing. I got in a conversation with my friends about it. He's huge in religion, and he said we could seriously start our own group, and then there's government funding. Like it's unbelievable.
Save
what
tax
you
money
can
on,
get,
what
just
you
can
put
get
up
Years ago.
through
a
the
sign
government
on your
to start
house
own
that you're
religion.
a church, and you
Yeah.
don't have to pay full taxes on your
Say you
house.
found
The funding for it, I think it has to be like a rural area, or there's a weird, because I read into that once because I heard it, and I'm like, oh, that's got to be crap, but like, it's got to be like there's no, you have to prove that like your church is needed where it's at somehow or something.
Yeah.
Well, there's no church on my whole block. I'm sure it's
Yeah.
needed. But, so, we think, okay, so Plato is basically trumped by Aristotle, and you realize, well, wait a minute, there's no grounds scientifically, there's no empirical grounds for saying there's something that exists that has no substance. And so Aristotle appears to be superior to that, and yet notice here we are in 2016, and a culture where all knowledge is available if you just want to plug into the internet and look it up, right? And guess what? A clear majority, I think, of our population essentially still accept a Platonic view of the nature of the self, which is kind of amazing, right?
Everybody needs hope.
I don't know, it just makes more sense overall. I mean, if you think about nothing being there, it doesn't explain each person's own individual thought.
Well,
So-
I mean, today, if we look, it's even worse, because how complex it is.
He does not look Jewish. He looks Mongolian.
He was actually originally from Spain.
Really?
His father and his two brothers fled Spain after El Cid conquered the Moors and insisted that all Jews be converted to Christianity or be killed or leave.
Yeah,
So they left, and he worked his way over to Egypt and got an education and ended up being Saladin's. Really quite an interesting guy, brilliant. They say from Moses to Moses, being Moses the one with the 10 Commandments, or 15, depending on which version of it you like.
Which Mel Brooks movie you're watching?
What a culture.
Yeah.
From Moses to Moses, there was no one like Moses. But here, this is very, very contemporary. I mean, this is 2004, but this guy's still teaching, and absolutely fascinating, Thomas Metzinger. And so if we're still trying to figure out, well, what is that self?
Description of a property of conscious space into a first-person description by using a concept like myself. What I want to do now is I want to analyze these phenomenal properties on the representationalist and functionalist level, on lower levels of description. I
He's
want to
talking about
ask
soul.
what would
What
it
is
mean
the soul?
for
What
a
is our
given
contemporary version
information
of the soul?
processing system to instantiate these properties. Let us start by analyzing these target properties. My first step will be to introduce a new theoretical entity. That's the phenomenal self model, or the conscious self model, or the PSM. I say something like that exists, and it will be found on all levels of explanation. It's a distinct theoretical entity. And at the very end of this talk, I will introduce a second theoretical entity.
So just to mention him. So this is contemporary stuff. Of course, he's not the only one out there. Of course, there's no one. I couldn't say that there's a whole bunch of agreement. You know, they're all arguing over how do we interpret all the neurological things that are going on and say this explains what we think of as our soul, as our self, right? And his argument, there is no self there. There's no identifiable, persistent self. What we have instead are these neurological processes that include basically programs where I use self-referential concepts to think of myself as a persistent self. Bill Jamison, 206-428-256, short, ugly, retired, all that stuff, right? That's my conceptual schema that I think of as myself, right? And it's totally housed in the wetware, right? So I have software running in my wetware, my brain, right? That is myself. So this is all very Aristotelian in the sense that it's physical substance, and it's how that behaves that gives me this sense of who I am.
So how do they explain people that are like brain dead but still have a pulse?
We don't know what death is anymore. It's kind of amazing because not only can we bring back people that have been frozen, right, basically, to some extent, right? You've heard of that, I guess.
Frozen, suspended animation.
Yeah, I mean, people have been like in a lake, and their body temperature is so low.
Right. Well, what is the body freeze or something?
For hours, and yet they can revive them. That's pretty darn amazing. Right?
Well, that's just the determination of the body, not the body of any living organism on the planet, and its desire to stay alive.
At that point, is it that body's desire, or is it the body that's trying to resuscitate that body?
Well,
Yeah,
in this case, if
I
you
wouldn't
talk
be able to
about
come back on my own. I would
Yeah.
definitely need the doctors and
cellular
the
function
very
slows
careful
way down.
warm-up
Yeah.
process that would bring you
Skills.
down.
Human functions are at
So
The
staying
red line.
alive at 40 degrees is easy for the body
But
relative to staying alive at 98.
doctors have to
Yeah.
define when you're dead. And if they define that you're dead while the brain is still functioning, what part of the brain are we talking about? Because certain parts of the brain are absolutely essential to breathing, heart beating, and so on. So those are in the primitive brain stem part. That's the basic homeostatic ability of the body to live, right? But then we have the other brain activity that we associate with the self, right? The thinking self that's in charge of itself and is aware of what's going on in the other parts of the brain as I'm thinking about things, right? That part could be dead while the other part of the brain stem is still alive. And that would be good because then body parts are fresher when they arrive at the airport for the individual that needs the liver and the kidneys and the lungs and so on. So doctors prefer to interpret brain death as the higher brain function and not the whole brain.
because it's more convenient for them.
They can make more money off the body parts, right? Because if they wait until the brain is completely dead, then you've got
That's a
deterioration. The whole 4 or 5 hour long trip for you to get to the hospital for the body parts to be delivered to the.
There's a case from California. She was a teenager. Something went wrong with her tonsils, or the tonsillectomy, and she bled out enough to actually go brain dead. So, under California law, she was actually declared dead because her brain was dead. The parents wouldn't allow it. They took it to court. They moved her out of state to New Jersey. And they're trying to get her reinstated as alive so that they can enact the process of suing the hospital because there's limitations on a death settlement versus malpractice for a live body. So it's limited at $200,000 if the person dies, but it's unlimited if the person is alive. So they're trying to reestablish her as alive, even though she is brain dead and has been for a couple of years. So just another avenue aside from harvesting
Yeah,
body
I've-
parts that
You
has
still have
money.
animation when you're brain dead, your chest still fluctuates.
Well,
You still have
we have
movement.
all kinds of complications in this regard. I mean, remember the woman who was pregnant, but was dead. They kept her body alive until she gave birth, till it was able to give birth, because they wanted to keep the child alive. So literally, the mother was dead for months. Officially, this was in California also.
That was like 7
And yet they kept the baby, not till term, but until it would have been viable to be born. And then
I haven't heard this mentioned in, I don't know, years, but I remember hearing a long time ago that there was like, when the body died, a certain amount of weight was lost. Does
I've
that
not-
sound familiar to anybody else?
Yeah, you lose a couple grams.
Was that, did that ever,
It was attributed to the soul leaving the body, but there's
Yeah.
no proof of that. I mean, there's-
yeah,
So,
I mean,
yeah,
it's just kind of what we're all talking about right now.
we
right?
can test it, just get a bunch of volunteers, weigh
Right.
them, kill them, weigh
Oh,
'em.
oh, well, I suppose even exhaling your last
Yeah.
might make a difference.
That's not gonna change. Alex.
No, it was like, they honestly couldn't explain it, like, so it wasn't as
Yeah.
simple as that, but
Yeah.
I haven't heard that in years either.
There's enough ways where it should be. You can see.
It wasn't like the bowels being released or anything?
No, because it wasn't anything easily explained, like, because they just,
It was supposed to be like cognitive energy, just.
or something, because they just wrote it off as like, there's no way to
Well,
explain
even
it.
after the brain's dead, all of the body functions are doing what they wanna do for as long as they possibly can. Your hair will keep growing, your fingernails will keep growing.
Mhm.
That'll actually be
Depends
one
on
of the
the
last
brain.
body functions that I know
I
of.
love hearing the stories of the morgues where the bodies in the various containers start making all sorts of noises, and some of them even get up and go for a walk,
They actually walk.
Well,
They'll get
those
up,
are the
try to
ones
get
that are
up,
still
but
alive.
Yeah.
Shouldn't have been in there.
Misdiagnosed as
It's not
being dead.
actually being alive. I've heard
But
stories like that.
it's interesting because, I've heard that the whole idea of awake was that you basically invited people over and they ate and have a party, hoping that you will wake up because they're not sure if you're dead or not. Thinking was that if you waited long enough, you could find out if you would wake up. And one of the reasons I understand that occurred was because drinking alcoholic beverages through pewter goblets leached the lead out of the pewter and could cause these kinds of symptoms where you might not actually be dead, but you'd basically be unconscious for that.
And you'd wake up and you'd be 3 or 4 or 5 or 6
And the
notches
Romans-
lower on the IQ scale.
Yeah.
The Romans, this is John Dominic Crossan argues that the Romans had a law that you had to be dead for 3 days or you weren't officially dead. So if you woke up before the 3 days were over, you hadn't been dead, right, basically. So why was Jesus supposedly dead for 3 days? Because that was the Roman law. If he hadn't been dead for 3 days, he wouldn't have been dead. But if, people argue, well, but he died Friday at 3 o'clock, right? Yeah. So he was dead Saturday, but he woke Sunday morning. That's not really 3 days, right? Right, you get the idea. There's conflict over whether Jesus had actually died on the cross or whether, I mean, among those that argued, that he couldn't really have been dead because he rose too soon, basically. Well, let's take a break, and we'll come back and talk about the Nicomachean ethics and politics. Is this interesting? Should we? I keep wondering, should we kind of do a more close reading of the text, or is everybody reading the book? and
This is
having-
much better.
This is much better than, I did email you finally regarding the first three.
Prison, life in prison, or that's
Oh,
what
yeah,
it's
so
existing?
what it was, he didn't even really kill anybody, his name was just added in like this big group of people. And so, they put his name on there and basically went through, the courts, and the judges just sentenced pretty much all of this entire group of people without really looking at, each individual to see what was going on, so.
Yeah.
It doesn't say if he's actually in prison or anything, it just says he was sentenced to, and it wasn't one murder,
And
it
he's
was.
probably at home watching.
It was 4 murders and the attempted murder of 8 other people. But it was before this kid was 2. So, I mean,
That makes
it's just a
no
big group,
way.
it was like a group of 115 people, they threw all the same charges on all of them, and this kid somehow got thrown into the
The justice system, man, it's
It's
Yeah.
Egypt.
yeah, still, but, could be anybody's justice system initially.
Yeah, well, how many visits do you have in this?
Did you hear I heard a reading story the other day, that guy did a life sentence of 25 years.
All right, can you hear me okay? Welcome, everyone.
But his was 30 years, I think, and 2 days after he got out of prison, he killed his mother. I was
Really?
like, what?
Was she one of the witnesses at his trial?
I have no idea, but like 30 years,
But
in
can you
prison, and
imagine
then
how your
killed.
mind changes for 30 years in prison?
Right.
I mean, but it's crazy. You think that a lot of those people usually go the opposite way. So him, he goes the same way, even after 30 years. I mean,
Well,
Is this interesting?
there's been plenty of
Yes.
people that go to prison
Yeah.
that were
I
innocent.
don't know, for me, it's just a lot to
Oh,
take
yeah.
in, and I'm trying to follow this since
Yeah.
I'm my first class, because I'm trying to,
I mean,
So-
it makes sense that a criminal could easily stay in prison.
Plato's
We just want to
thought
believe
went
that it
into
works,
the
but was
Catholic
it
Church
really
or for
working?
Christians,
And I think that's what that
right,
article was trying to
on
say.
religion,
Well, I
for the
think
soul,
you
Initially.
miss the point of prison.
initially. And
We
then,
like to think of it as a
and
thing
his
where someone's
outlook
gonna go
is that
and
the
be
soul
rehabilitated.
Right.
what
I
was
would
important,
prefer
that
we
it,
think
once
of it
a person
as
were
a
to, was
place
to
where
die,
we
that
send
the
people
soul
that are not
would go on to,
Plato.
to be in
for better
society.
things, okay.
So-
Then, so
No,
Aristotle's
it doesn't
look
have
on
to
it
be a
is
bad
that once
place
the
to
body
go
dies,
to,
the soul
but
is
they're no
gone.
longer fit for
Right.
society.
And so
Just
Christianity
make damn sure
actually
that
turned
it's-
to Aristotle's
so
point of view.
Well, that's
Yeah,
where
it
it
is.
gets interesting,
We make it
because
hard,
not
make it
everybody
harder
wanted
than
to
it needs
agree
to
with
be,
that.
especially
Yeah,
when you put
okay.
So you
guys
have a
up there
split.
in front of everybody
So,
that
so when we look at
monster egos.
Protestant
Everybody's
Reformation,
all about
the
legal.
breakup
O.J. Simpson.
of the church.
Because he definitely.
Certainly politics is part of it,
I think they've
and
proven that
beginnings
now.
of nation
Well, they did in the
states and
second
so
trial,
on.
which was
So there's
about
all kinds of
kids.
interesting things that go on that
Kids.
are part of why the
And then
church
I think
ends
that's
up
why they made
breaking
that
up.
movie
Okay.
recently
But
with,
among the priests that led the breakup
Junior.
were people like
Yeah.
Martin
yeah, I
Luther,
don't know what that's about. I
who
haven't watched
were
it.
theologians
I heard-
that disagreed with
I haven't heard much.
the theology of
Do you,
Aquinas
do you remember?
and wanted to stick to
all
the
the activity
theology
back in the
of
90s
Augustine.
of that?
I was
The
very
Plato.
young.
Yeah,
so
Okay.
I
Point
had
of view,
kids.
right?
Okay,
Very
so
good.
Augustine is
Yeah,
the
yeah,
point
I
of view of,
remember sitting
okay,
around the
of
dinner
Plato,
table,
okay.
breakfast table talking
So,
about
so,
it.
I was born in '88.
so it
Yeah,
looks,
okay,
it
but you
looks
were
like
very little.
basically
Yeah,
one of the main
2001,
reasons
2 or
Protestant,
3.
Yeah.
like,
I mean,
like
yeah, that was-
Lutheran,
I was a little bit older then.
Calvinist,
Yeah,
I
remember-
can remember him playing
Presbyterians,
football.
Yeah, it was- I
their
don't know.
original
I know
break
it was
off
cool.
from the Catholic
Makes
Church
sense.
is
One
because of the
big straws
complexity
at the time.
of the theology that develops with Aquinas, who's based on Aristotle.
Fully,
Okay.
there were
Right.
so many
So he's reforming,
flaws
and by the way,
in
the
whole
Catholic Church is
trial
still
thing. His,
using
not
Aquinas
the
as the
judge.
main theologian. Augustine
The
is
first
there.
trials were saying.
We'll see that
Yes,
when we're
it's
talking
criminal
about how
trial, yeah.
Aquinas
tended to
solved
be
this
more
merger
because it was
of
such a
bringing
high-profile trial.
Aristotle's philosophy into the dogma of the
Stars,
church.
Very well-known people
But
in California would show up.
the
not
complexity
getting
of
paid
it
just to be there for
really
that
made a
day.
mess of the
And
way
the judge
things
would
worked out.
call it short,
and a
and
lot
then
of
have the
people
bailiff
didn't like
go
it
ask
until you had
whoever
this
was
kind of revolutionary
perceived as pretty
break
cool
off of
Yeah.
different
to come
sects
and pay him a
that
visit
it
after.
really multiplied, because
So he
once
wasn't even taking the trial serious.
once that
And
control of the
yeah.
whole church over all
And I don't
Christians
remember his name.
fell apart, then there was
But
no
yeah, there's
restraint
just-
on
on
the
so many different
multiplying
levels,
of
people
all the
would
different
not
points of
take
view.
And that was
So-
the main reason why?
You get away with
One of
murder.
them.
He was
Yeah.
That's literally where that
There's-
thing
there's,
should come from.
Just here in Anchorage, there are about 250 churches.
And if
they
you're
call themselves
wealthy
Christian.
enough,
And
or
you could go from one to the other, and there's an
Well,
awful lot of
yeah.
things that are totally
Yeah.
different from one to the other.
Dark roots, absolutely.
Whereas if you go to
Yeah,
the
it's-
Catholic
no.
churches, they're all the same.
It's a very easy.
Every, you know,
well, given time, it
the
doesn't matter how
reasons
noble
why
the person is.
everything
given,
is
some
functioning
people, maybe
exactly
it
the
takes
same
10 minutes,
in
some
all the
people, it may
Catholic
take
churches.
20 years.
And it's a
But
monarchy.
If it takes 20
I
years,
mean, the
then
Pope,
by the
you know,
21st year,
the
then
Pope
it's
gets
gotta be
elected by the College of Cardinals
Mhm.
from among their own members, right? But nonetheless, it's once he's elected, he's basically the monarch in charge of the Roman Empire still, right? The way I look at it.
Yeah.
And so all the Catholic churches basically have
I
to
was
follow
in there, like, the next day I said,
the practices.
I bet you that's happened before.
Just the mass will be the same, whether it's in Spanish in Mexico, in English here in Eagle River, or, you know,
Kids
French
involved,
in,
and I don't wanna say
you know,
kids are
Vaughan,
not,
yes.
they make.
whatever town you're in, you know.
And look,
Mhm.
you know,
They exploit it for their own means, which is.
But that's,
because they-
there's more and more stuff that happens.
that little bit
The
of,
Protestant
1 second little thing, you look at that, and then.
churches do not stay
I just looked at
that
it
way.
on the.
They become very dynamic, and while initially the breakup seems to be for very specific reasons,
Yeah.
the continuing spread really introduces things like capitalism, the modern thought of the individual, the socially contracted theory that explains government, why government exists.
Is that Star Wars?
It's just absolutely fascinating.
No,
how
the,
that-
the sound that your
that
phone
works
made,
out.
something, yeah.
So there's an interesting argument
Yeah,
that
like Star Wars.
from Martin Luther and John Calvin, who basically say the church shouldn't tell us how we should think. We have our own interpretation of our relationship to Jesus, and that's how we're saved, right? That ends up inspiring John Knox, who's a Calvinist, to go to Scotland and starts the Presbyterian church there. And the presbyters decide that they're going to vote on who is the minister for their church and what their church professes. So it becomes the individuals, the wealthy, that are the main contributors to running the church. They end up voting and running the church. And after a while of successful running the church this way, it comes to their mind, why don't we run our government, our local government, the same way? And so they do. So they begin having individuals in the community working together in a social contract with one another for the best interest of themselves to run the government of the community. And that trickles down and influences the college university in Edinburgh, and that stimulates the political thinking of the people like Thomas Hobbes, who eventually then, it's really the Whig Party. They eventually are going to have the revolt against the crown. They lose, but those that survived went to the new colonies, and they started teaching there at like William and Mary. And guess what? Thomas Jefferson and others go to William and Mary, and so they grow up with this Whig philosophy. And guess what? They decide, okay, well, we're going to do this too. So they revolt against, so it's this chain of thinking that goes from the Protestant rebellion against the church to the idea that individuals are the basis for the social contract, right? And the social contract then leads to a new form of government. It becomes the United States. So in a sense, we clearly are a Protestant Christian country. And by the way, if you look around the world, what you discover, and Fukuyama pretty much argues this, nobody becomes a democracy with capitalism as the main business practice of the country unless they've been Christian Protestant. So Catholic countries have trouble. So like the more Catholic southern Italy is not capitalistic. That's why they have so much job problems, and their mafia organized, they're tribal, basically. The Greeks are also, not Protestant. Spain is not Protestant. So where you look at all the countries in Europe that are having all these economic problems, they're not Protestant, Christian, Northern European countries. And of course the U.S. is Protestant, Christian also.
Now, is that causation
Mexico.
or correlation?
Well, that's a real good question, but if you think, remember Max Weber argues that the Protestant culture gives us this work ethic. Never talked about that. So I'm not making this stuff up myself, by the way. So Max Weber makes this connection that the work ethic is associated with the Protestant areas. And it's pretty interesting, the argument. And what we also see today is, like in places in Mexico where things are improving, it's usually after the Protestantization of the members in that area, the evangelization of those individuals. They're moving away from the Catholic Church.
Because I've never heard it as a work ethic thing. I've always heard it as simple property rights. Like as soon as you get to a point where you can own property, and even like the lowest person on the totem pole can own property, that's when capitalism starts to take over.
Yes. It's kind of interesting. Britain seems to be the start for this.
Yeah, with I can
Elizabeth. It's occurring with Elizabeth. They begin mapping out their property, and the nobles begin trying to make money off of sheep by
the
wool.
Bourgeois. I can never say the name right.
Oh, bourgeoisie.
Yeah. That's
the
where it
growing
started.
the growing of the fourth estate, the bourgeoisie.
Yeah, wasn't it like the king was out to war or something, and then it was left, so he wasn't able to watch over England or whatever it was at the time as closely, and then they kind of started to hash things out, and that's when the bourgeoisie.
Well, Richard was away. His brother John was hated. And so they eventually, but that I think is much earlier.
Is it?
Yeah. What's interesting is when you hear about George Washington out surveying the countryside in the New World, that's a new tool that the British have just really started using in England, and so they pick it up and they begin using it. And the reason that surveying becomes important is because you want to know what the property is, and basically you end up then with legal organization registering the property in the owner's name, and it's supported by the government itself. When we look at other countries, non-Western European countries that weren't influenced by that kind of property ownership, where you have property, you can use it as investment, you can have it as equity, build up and everything. Yeah. And so you could use it as leverage, to invest in companies and so on. There's an interesting argument that you can't do that, say, in Peru. This book, which I found really interesting, is where I got that development. He basically outlines how property became a protected function of government in England primarily, and then spread to some other.
Well, it's like the current Pope hates capitalism, and that's because of how it came about in Argentina. Like it's a mess down there. Like
He doesn't
it's
necessarily hate capitalism, he just doesn't like, I'll term it unbridled capitalism. Capitalism for capitalism's sake, just
yeah.
no holds barred. It doesn't matter how you make money, you just make it. That's all that counts.
Yeah, well, and down in Argentina, like there's bloodshed and stuff involved in capitalism.
It's
Where
been
like
for decades.
yeah,
Well, part of the way I see this is and it goes back still to Pope John Paul II in a book about Descartes, arguing that thanks to Descartes, we begin thinking of ourselves as individuals first, as opposed to our social connections. So that's part of the interesting thing with Martha Nussbaum and others, that Aristotle doesn't have this sense of the individual. That's a new thing, and it arrives roughly around Descartes. It's actually interesting. Harold Bloom argues it arrives with Shakespeare in a very specific play, and that is Hamlet. So if you look at, but this book, by the way, argues that if you go to Peru, you can't buy a piece of property, because the town has no property lines, so you can't figure out how, as a business, to come in and literally buy a piece of property and own it, because everyone will basically want to get a piece of the pie, and no one will really appreciate it. By the way, the Soviet Union was the same thing. If you tried to organize, say, a car dealership there, and you brought your cars there, the first day you'd come into the floor and expect to start selling cars, and all the cars were gone. When you called the important people to find out what happened to the cars, they would drive up in the cars, find out what your concern was. So
That's Why Nations Fail, runs along the same lines as this then, except for this is more specific.
why third world nations haven't become first world nations.
Right. And he talks about South America in general and the way that the Spanish and Portugal infiltrated and the way they set up systems was totally different than the people that actually came from North America. The mindset, Washington, with the concept of Jefferson going to William and Mary, whatever schooling. But down in South America, they were infiltrated and basically turned into slaves.
Yeah.
Spain and Portugal went in there looking for gold, looking for silver, and whoever was there were going to be the laborers trying to extract that and ship it back home.
yeah, it's like that makes a lot of sense, because if like people coming to North America, they weren't met by Incans and Aztecs. Like
No,
there wasn't
and-
giant gold temples already in
And
place.
the
that
Indians
just
that were here didn't have a concept of ownership.
yeah.
So when we showed up, they're not prepared for us thinking land, we're standing on it, therefore we own it. They're not thinking that we're thinking that way. So they
Yeah.
got polarized.
Yeah.
And John Locke argued that if you weren't developing your land and making it profitable, then you didn't deserve to keep it.
Really?
Yeah, so the person that owned it was the one, by the sweat of their brow, hewed down the trees and made a farm and built the house.
So squatters' rights.
You own it because you developed it. Really. But this, so Pope John Paul II argued that it was Descartes' fault that we began this turn towards ourselves as individuals, right? I think, therefore I am, right? That's Descartes. But Descartes would have read Shakespeare, or maybe even seen a production of the play, Hamlet. And so Harold Bloom basically argues that in Shakespeare's plays, you can look at the other plays, the earlier plays before Hamlet, and no one thinks to themselves about themselves until Hamlet, when all of a sudden we get that soliloquy, the famous soliloquy where Hamlet's standing there not talking to the audience, talking to himself. He's not talking to God. Augustine talks to God all the time, but Hamlet's talking, thinking to himself. And Harold Bloom argues that's the invention of the human. That's when what we think of as the soul today arrives. Because I'm now self-consciously aware of myself as a self. So I have a whole conceptual schema, a program that's been installed by my language and my culture that enables me to think about myself. Here I am, and I have these characteristics. I want to do this. How do I have to behave in order to do this, and so on. And arguably, other cultures that haven't gone through this kind of evolution of thought don't have that kind of self-program that individuals get loaded. I mean, it obviously can influence people that are influenced by the West. So for example, Arabs that come to Western universities and then become Westernized, and then go back home, want Western-like countries there that are based on the idea of individual rights and the social contract, and they literally decide, okay, enough of you, Mubarak, we're going to have our own democracy, right? And they overthrow Mubarak, and then discover that no, there's so many people there that are supporting the Muslim Brotherhood, which is totally not democratic, basically overthrowing any possibility of a democracy occurring, that they were actually better off with Mubarak. Oh my God, what are we doing? Yeah, no, it's worse, right?
Look at Syria.
But what's cool, of course, is connecting this really long, it took hundreds and hundreds of years, really, in Europe for this kind of consciousness to develop very slowly through literature and other tools that enabled individuals to basically move from DOS 0.1 to DOS 3020, or whatever version we're on of the self, right?
Yeah.
And you can't just like take someone and instantly say, okay, you're a Democrat now. Now you get a vote. Now you can own property. That sounds totally illegal to them, because God should tell me what to do. The Imam tells me what to do. I don't want to break God's will, and you're telling me that I can be my own person and dress however I want. Oh, I don't want to be stoned to death. Right?
Yeah, you
can't just
skip
top
the
down.
steps.
No, you can't
like,
skip the steps. You have to.
Because if you look at even like the countries where like even us going into Iraq, whether or not you agree with that, like we got rid of that leader and we're like, okay, you guys are a democracy now, and like look at all the problems that they have because
we can kill anyone we want now. There's no more rule.
Yeah, like they didn't go through the steps to get there.
I read
you have
book
no foundation for
by,
it.
Sorry, I keep referring to books, but that's.
You read a lot of books?
I read a lot of books. But Rory Stewart, he was here too. Walk across the country. Forget the places in between. So yeah, he's written other books since, but this nutter, that's what his friends all called him, the nutter, literally walked across Afghanistan by himself after the first war that we had after 9/11 and we attacked the Taliban. He went for a walk across Afghanistan.
During that period of time?
Yes, all by himself. Absolutely crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah, read the book. It's amazing.
Had a solid stronghold in Afghanistan.
No, he walked from one end to Kabul.
Yeah, but after
he ended
we
up
had a
in
pretty
Kabul.
stronghold in Afghanistan, because there was a lot of supporters. I was in.
We weren't there in January '02.
Not officially.
Well, we definitely didn't have a stronghold in
No,
'02.
No, not in '02.
Yeah.
There's no
Oh, sweet,
stronghold
yes,
that
he
he sees.
held
There's a
it
couple
quite a
places
bit,
where he
yeah.
sees some like British forces.
Mhm.
There's one town, if you call it a town, but he gets there, he just happens to arrive there right when American helicopters arrive. They gather the townspeople all around. They set up a stage with a sound system and a microphone. And an American diplomat gets off the helicopter and stands there and addresses the people in English, which no one there understood whatsoever. But the cameras are running, right? So this is a Western opportunity to, propaganda for back home. The people are all just, wow, what is all this, No idea. And Rory Stewart's in the crowd, and he's listening to the guy says, okay, so now you're a democracy, and you're going to have votes, and, rule of law, all this stuff, equal opportunity for everyone, all this American nonsense for there, right? And he's like looking around, and the way he writes it, he's just describing what happened. He doesn't say this is totally nonsense. He just describes it. It's like, this is
Complete nonsense.
complete. Yeah, you figure it out for yourself. As you realize what the heck is going on here. Yeah, that's. By the way, Francis Fukuyama, who I really recommend him. He. If you're familiar with the political thinking, Leo Strauss and the neoconservative, the neocons, right? He was one of them. He was one of the Rand Corporation, the thinkers that basically supported what we call the neocon. But as things began to work in Iraq and so on, he exited himself from there. He said, no, this isn't going to work. You cannot top-down create democracy. You have to work step by step, education.
Build the foundation.
50 years. 50 years. You have to train generations of young kids to basically start thinking like Westerners in order to do this, right? And by the way, of course, Islam rightly interprets this as an attack on their culture.
It was.
And rightfully so.
Yeah. And still, I mean, that's one of the heart of the problems still, of why they attack us.
Yeah, because we're an invading force. Like if you picture like another country coming in and doing the same to us, like a majority of Muslims of a Muslim culture came in and said our government was all wrong and started trying to get us to change everything, like you're damn right everybody would join up against that force. I mean, it just makes sense.
Yeah. Let me play a little bit of him, because these. This is the title, Political Order and Political Decay, is the title of his second volume. The first one is The Origin of Political Order. 2-volume set. I mean, they came out way apart, but nonetheless, I think it's absolutely exceptional. I'll play a little bit of him so you can get used to it.
Welcome everyone. I'm Charles Davidson, the publisher of The American Interest, and we're delighted to co-sponsor this event with SAIS and its International Development Program and Foreign Policy Institute. And we particularly thank Robin Washington, who has handled the planning and preparation of this event.
Is this too loud?
The American Interest magazine and website is to a great extent a SAIS emanation, founded when Dr. Fukuyama was a professor here, with his SAIS colleagues Zbigniew Brzezinski and Elliot Cohen among the founding members, and our editor Adam Garfinkel, also SAIS affiliated at various times in his career. Our first employee and publisher of the American Interest Online, Damir Marusik, a SAIS grad, and we have hired many SAIS grads over the years. And some of our employees have gone on to study at SAIS after working at the American Interest. our offices being around the corner, we've found that proximity and familiarity breed respect. But now we have lost Dr. Fukuyama to the incomparable weather of Northern California, where he is the Olivier Nomelini Senior Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. More importantly, chairman of the American Interest and its editorial board. Dr. Fukuyama's talk today will be based on his new book, Political Order and Political Decay,
This guy's
from
horrible.
the Industrial Revolution to the
This guy?
Globalization
Yeah,
of
because all you see is the top of his
the
head.
second volume
He
of
thinks he has
his
to be on top of his
landmark
mic.
History of
Well, we
Political
can-
And
Development.
get his mouth a little
Please
farther.
join me in welcoming Francis Fukuyama.
Yeah. There we go. Bye-bye, guys.
Those mics will pick you up, you're fine, thanks for that.
Well, thanks very much for that introduction, Charles. I'm really, really glad to be back here. It's actually a very familiar podium because I've actually given quite a few presentations from this very spot. And so this event brings together two of my favorite institutions, the American Interest, which Charles just introduced, and SAIS, where I taught for 9 years. And I see so many former colleagues and students and friends around the room, so it's really wonderful to be here. So thank you for having me back. So I'm going to talk about this book, which started out, it's a 2-volume work. In fact, I presented the first volume, The Origins of Political Order, here in 2011, and now the second volume is out. It's organized historically. I'll explain the genesis of it. It really started as an effort to rewrite Samuel Huntington's classic 1968 book, Political Order in Changing Societies, and I feel I have a debt to him, both personally, since he was a mentor of mine, but also intellectually for reasons that I will explain. So I think the simplest way to introduce the ideas in the book is just by talking about the year 2014, because it's been a terrible year. It's actually good for students of international relations because you've got a lot to talk about. But in terms of world order, it's been a pretty bad year. But the reason it's bad is different in different places. So the world is actually bifurcated, I think, between Eurasia, which at either end has got 2 authoritarian powers, Russia and China, which are both on the move. They've got a territorial agenda. They've got a lot of self-confidence right now, and it's creating some major problems for their neighbors and for the United States and other Western countries. But the other part of the world, which Zbigniew Brzezinski used to refer to as the arc of crisis, has got almost the opposite problem. So this big swath from North Africa through sub-Saharan Africa on into the Arab world and then up through Afghanistan and Pakistan is characterized by almost the opposite as Russia and China. There's a remarkable absence either of states altogether, as in Libya or Syria or Iraq, or states are extremely weak. I am happy to expand on this in the Q&A, but it is my expressed opinion that ISIS, that everybody's been preoccupied with in the last few weeks, is actually not that powerful an actor. It is powerful only because everybody around it is so weak and not able to fulfill the basic functions of states, which is to provide security and a monopoly of force over a given territory. And if you look at where jihadism has spread over the last few years, it's basically been driven into political vacuums. So it started in Afghanistan, got pushed into Pakistan, and got pushed into Yemen, and now it's being pushed into the Sahel and on into places like northern Nigeria, Mali, Cameroon, and so forth. And again, the reason that it can be pushed in this fashion is these are the places where you don't really have state structures that are capable of providing basic security. And it's had big implications for American foreign policy because unlike the way you deal with a Russia or a China, which is a very conventional 19th, 20th century type of problem where you're dealing with a strong centralized state, in this part of the world, American foreign policy has completely depended on our ability to actually create state institutions as a way of controlling terrorism, and ultimately, once we intervened, this was the only way that we could get out,
with some modicum of dignity or self-respect by trying to leave self-sustaining state structures in our place. And I am sorry to observe that 13 years after September 11th, we don't seem to be terribly good at this. And we've not, and I think as the experience in both Iraq and Afghanistan indicate, it's not clear that we're going to leave anything terribly durable by way of institutions. And so I think this is the problem we face, is a kind of lack of stateness in very critical parts of the world. So let me start with a couple of political definitions of what I mean by political order, because I think this is very important in understanding how countries differ around the world and what the agenda, the political development agenda that we really face is. So the first, so I've argued, and this is a structure that carries over from the first volume of the book. I think that a modern political order has got three separate baskets or pillars, institutions that support it. First pillar is the state. The state is all about power. State is about being able to generate and use power to protect its citizens, to provide infrastructure, to deliver basic services like health and education. You can see the importance of states and states that actually can generate power in the current Ebola crisis in West Africa, because the reason that this has become a crisis, such a severe crisis in those countries, is you're dealing with states that don't have public health authorities or have extremely weak ones. So the state is really this Weberian monopoly of force, legitimate monopoly of force over territory. The second pillar, institutional pillar, is the rule of law. Law can be used to control a population, but rule of law, as I think it's properly understood, only exists if it applies to the most powerful people in a given society, the people with coercive power. So if the president or the prime minister, the king, whatever, is able to make up the rules as